My name is Ava Miller, and at 35, I work as a graphic designer. My husband, David, and I live in a peaceful suburban pocket of Austin, Texas. Our home is a modest ranch-style house nestled on a tree-lined street, a stone's throw from Zilker Park. Visitors often remark on its idyllic charm, its almost picture-perfect quality. A meticulously maintained front lawn adorned with rose bushes, spotless white window frames. It's the kind of house that could grace the cover of a real estate magazine. But behind that appealing facade, things aren't quite as flawless as they appear. David and I have been married for 16 years, having tied the knot at a very young age. I was 19, and he was 22. Back then, I was utterly convinced that we were destined to be together. He was my first real boyfriend, my first love, my everything. Our wedding was a small, intimate ceremony held in a local church in my rural Texas hometown, surrounded by all our relatives. I vividly remember thinking, this is what true happiness feels like, and it will last forever. The forever part has technically held true, at least on paper. In reality, life has often painted a different picture. David works in the film industry, primarily as a production manager. His job keeps him constantly on the move, whether he's on location, attending long nights and receptions, or stuck in endless meetings. I used to be thrilled by it all, his boundless energy, his captivating stories from the set, the glamorous names he casually dropped. Over time, though, I began to wonder if that world was slowly driving a wedge between us. I'm much more of a homebody by nature. As a graphic designer, I often work remotely, spending long hours alone, immersed in creating layouts and campaigns for various Austin-based agencies. We don't have children. Initially, it was a deliberate choice, as we both wanted to prioritize our careers. Later, when the timing might have been right, it felt like the opportune moment had slipped away. Sometimes, I find myself regretting it, while other times, I'm strangely relieved. Our marriage is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of both closeness and distance. We still share laughter and many ingrained habits, but something vital feels like it's missing. A sense of effortless ease, an unshakable trust, the kind I once envisioned we would always possess. That Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than David. Bright stripes of sunlight streamed across the bedroom wall, and I lay still, listening to his gentle breathing. I couldn't help but wonder if he ever lay awake, contemplating us. Eventually, I got out of bed, slipped on my robe, and headed to the kitchen. The comforting aroma of coffee filled the air, accompanied by the familiar hum of the machine. Small rituals like these always seemed to ground me. While I waited for the coffee to brew, I idly scrolled through my phone. A text message from my best friend Jane popped up. "Hey, how's your movie star doing?" Phone glued to his hand. "I bet. Come to the farmer's market with me today. You need a distraction." She always playfully referred to him as a movie star, even though he wasn't one, only in the sense that he worked among them. Jane had often hinted that she didn't quite trust him. "Too many beautiful colleagues, too many nights away," she'd say. I'd always brushed off her concerns, but on that particular morning, with a steaming cup of coffee in my hand, those old doubts began to gnaw at me again. "Morning," I finally heard David say from the hallway. He entered the kitchen, still groggy and clad only in his shorts, immediately reaching for his phone. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes glued to his screen. "Yeah, everything's fine." I took a sip of my coffee, watching him over the rim of the cup. "Just have to check some emails real quick," he mumbled. "New York was exhausting. Everything always piles up." "Of course," I said, but inside I was thinking, always that phone, always that work. He seemed to notice my tone and looked up. "What?" "Nothing." "Ava," he sighed. "We've been over this. I'm not doing this to ignore you. It's my job." I forced a smile. "I know. I'm just going to clean the bathroom real quick." "Cleaning again," he chuckled briefly, shaking his head. "You're crazy. Saturday morning, and you want to scrub tile. Someone has to do it. Let's just have breakfast together instead." In a minute, I began cleaning the bathroom mechanically, as I always did, and that's when I saw it. A blonde hair in our shower. Thin, light, definitely not mine, and certainly not his. In that instant, everything I had only vaguely felt before, the mistrust, the uncertainty, the distance, suddenly crystallized into something real. A small, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence, but sharp as a knife. I stared at the hair in my hand as if I had unearthed proof of a crime. Thin, almost translucent in the light, but undeniably blonde. My breathing quickened. I have black hair. David has black hair. We live alone. I felt a wave of heat rise under my rubber gloves. I held the hair up, examined it one more time, then quickly tossed it into the trash can, as if I could somehow erase it from my mind. But the image was seared into my brain. Ava! David's voice called from the kitchen. Everything okay? Yes, I called back, a little too quickly, my voice a little too high-pitched. A few seconds later, he appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, hair tousled, still half asleep. You seem off. I forced myself to appear calm. I'm fine. Just doing a quick clean. He took a step closer. You're pale. Don't you want to sit down instead? I forced a smile. No, it's okay. I'll be done in a minute. David studied me, then raised an eyebrow. Okay, but please don't stress yourself out with cleaning so much. You really overdo it sometimes. It just has to be done, I replied, wiping the shower wall precisely where the blonde hair had been clinging moments before. He placed his cup on the edge of the sink, putting a hand on my shoulder. Babe, it's the weekend. Come on, let's have breakfast. I looked at him. There was a warmth and familiarity in his dark eyes, but also that underlying distance that had been making me so uneasy these past few months. In a minute, I mumbled. I'll be done in a second. The mood at the breakfast table was strained. David cracked eggs, scrambling them in the pan as if everything were completely normal. I sat with my coffee cup, watching his every move, observing the casual ease with which he moved, as if he had absolutely nothing to hide. So, he began, as he placed the pan on the table. I was thinking we could go for a walk in Zilker Park today. Just the two of us. Unwind for a bit. Sounds great, I said automatically, but my thoughts immediately began to race. Just the two of us? Or had someone else been here recently? I reached for the salt shaker but then put it back down because my hands were trembling slightly. David noticed it. Are you okay? Yeah, of course. He put his fork down. You seem tense. Is something wrong? I took a deep breath. Now or never, I thought. But how do you even broach a subject like that? Hey, I just found a blonde hair in our shower. Can you explain that? Instead, I asked, hey, did you take a shower yesterday evening after I had already gone to bed? He blinked, looking confused. Yeah, why? No reason. I tried to sound casual. It just occurred to me that the bathroom was so humid this morning. Huh, he picked up his fork again, chewing. Yeah, it was late. I was sweaty from the drive back from New York. I nodded, staring at my scrambled eggs, but barely ate anything. After a while, I asked, and how was New York? Stressful as always, he replied, shrugging his shoulders. Long days, chaotic crew, but at least the premiere was well attended. The press was there, too. Did you see any colleagues you already knew? I asked, trying to sound overly casual. He laughed quietly. Colleagues? Why are you asking like that? Just curious. Yeah, sure. You always run into people. The business is small. Why? I took a sip of coffee, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. He put his fork down, looking at me searchingly. Ava, if something is on your mind, just say it. We've been married for 16 years. I can tell when something is bothering you. I forced a smile. I'm fine, really. He studied me for another moment, then slowly nodded. All right, but, you can talk to me about anything. Can I? I thought. After breakfast, he cleared the plates. I remained seated at the table, staring blankly into space. The blonde hair wouldn't leave my mind. The more I thought about it, the less I could dismiss it as a mere coincidence. Images began to form in my head. Another woman in our shower, laughing as David hands her my shampoo. Blonde, confident, a stranger. My throat tightened. As David placed the plates in the dishwasher, he said, You look like your mind is a million miles away. I forced a calm tone. Just have a lot on my mind. Work, Jane. All kinds of things. He nodded, seeming to accept my explanation. But I knew from that moment on, I would start paying closer attention. The days following the discovery of the blonde hair felt surreal. It was as if the world had subtly shifted on its axis, and everything was now slightly off-kilter. On the surface, our daily routine remained unchanged. David worked long hours, made phone calls, wrote emails, and left for various appointments. In the evenings, we sat together at the table, ate dinner, and engaged in polite small talk. But for me, every sentence, every movement, every tiny gesture had taken on a new, unsettling significance. I noticed that he had recently started placing his phone face down on the table. Before, it would always lie face up, allowing me to see when a message came in. Now, it remained hidden. I noticed he was spending more time in the bathroom in the evenings. The water would run, the fan would hum. Sometimes, I even heard him humming. Previously, I hadn't given it a second thought. Now, I couldn't help but wonder who he was showering so enthusiastically for when I was already in my pajamas. I noticed he was shaving more often, even on days when he supposedly only had office work. All small things, maybe just coincidences, maybe not. At night, I lay awake beside him. He slept soundly, his breathing steady, sometimes punctuated by a soft snore. I stared into the darkness and wondered if I was simply going crazy, if I was searching for something that wasn't there, or if, on the contrary, I had been deliberately looking the other way for far too long. 2 days later, I texted Jane, my closest confidant. I didn't truly want to confide in her, but the secret was burning a hole in my chest. "Time for coffee? I need a distraction," she replied almost instantly. Always. Daily Grind Cafe, 4 p.m. We met at the Daily Grind Cafe. It was crowded, as usual. The irresistible aroma of fresh pastries hung in the air, and tourists were lined up at the counter. Jane was already seated by the window, looking as vibrant and energetic as ever. "There you are," she said as I sat down. "You look tense." I waved off her comment, forcing a smile. "Too much work." "Work," she said, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "Or too much, David," I said. "Nothing," taking a sip of my cappuccino. "All right," she said after a moment. "You don't have to tell me, but you know I can see it in your face." I stared into my cup, stirring the foam with my spoon. "It's nothing concrete, just little things." "Little things," she repeated. I nodded. "You know when you suddenly start noticing things you never paid attention to before? A different cologne when he comes home late. A phone lying face down on the table." She remained silent, but I could feel her gaze on me. "Maybe I'm just imagining it," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I'm seeing ghosts." Jane took a sip of her coffee, slowly setting the cup back down. "Ghosts are usually not ghosts," she murmured. "Sometimes it's just what's been in the room the whole time." I looked up at her. "You mean?" She shrugged. "I don't mean anything. I'm just saying you should look closer." We lapsed into silence. Outside, crowds of people hurried by, carrying shopping bags, their laughter and chatter creating a jumble of voices. I felt as though I were separated from that normalcy, trapped behind a pane of glass. "You know him," Jane said finally, her voice softening. "You can tell when someone is different, when they suddenly have secrets. You're not stupid." I nodded, but the lump in my throat only seemed to grow larger. On the way home, I walked through the narrow city streets, the sounds of the city swirling all around me, but inside, it was utterly quiet. Her words echoed in my mind. You can tell when someone is different. And indeed, I started to meticulously catalog everything. The unfamiliar scent of soap clinging to David that we had never bought, the absent smile that would occasionally flicker across his face as he looked at his phone, the way he chose his clothes with more care than before, even when he was just going to the office. I said nothing. I simply collected every detail, every deviation. An invisible log was being compiled in my head. But the more I observed, the clearer it became. It was no longer just my imagination. Something was definitely going on, and I was determined to find out what it was. It started with a small detail that I almost overlooked: my shampoo. I had been using the same brand for years, a thick, dark liquid with a herbal scent that always provided me with a sense of stability. David wasn't particularly fond of the scent. He had his own neutral body wash, always the same one. We had maintained this unspoken division for years, my shelf, his shelf, like two small territories that we never questioned. But one evening, while I was showering, I noticed that the bottle felt lighter than usual. I shook it, and sure enough, it was at least a third emptier than it should have been. I had just purchased it. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Perhaps I had underestimated the amount, or maybe I had been more wasteful than I realized. But over the next few days, I began to pay closer attention. I always placed the bottle back in the exact same spot, subtly marking a line in the plastic with my fingernail. And then, after 3 days, it became undeniable. The shampoo was being depleted without my help. A shiver ran down my spine. David hated that smell. He had never touched it, never even considered it. Why would he suddenly start using mine? It was an anomaly, a foreign pattern. Someone else had to have been here. I stood in the bathroom one morning, the bottle in my hand, staring at the contents that were dwindling far too quickly. The light from the fluorescent lamp glinted off the plastic. My heart pounded in my temples. She was here, whoever she was. She stood here in my shower, washed her hair while I was perhaps sitting in the living room or lying in bed. She used my shampoo. The thought constricted my throat. It was no longer just a stray blonde hair that could potentially be explained away. This was more intimate, more direct. Someone had taken my place, touched my things, and even adopted my scent. I felt displaced, a stranger in my own home. During the day, I tried to conceal my growing unease. David worked as usual, made calls, laughed at some joke on the other end of the line, but I now perceived him through a different lens. Every time he walked past me, I surreptitiously inhaled, attempting to detect even a faint trace of my shampoo, but there was none. He wasn't using it, so who was? In the evening, I met Jane again. It wasn't planned this time. She had simply called me. "Feel like a glass of wine? I'm in town." I agreed, simply because I couldn't bear to carry the weight of my suspicions alone any longer. We sat in a small, dimly lit bar on Division Street, with candles flickering on the tables and the murmur of other patrons' conversations providing a soft background hum. I cautiously recounted the shampoo incident, almost apologetically, as if it were a ridiculous detail. She listened intently, her arms crossed, her expression serious. "So," she said after a moment, "either he's using it secretly, or someone else is using it." "Exactly," I mumbled. "And you don't think it was him?" I shook my head. "He can't stand the smell. He's never touched it. Never." She took a sip of her wine, slowly setting the glass down. "Then you know what that means." I remained silent. A storm was raging within me, but I couldn't articulate it. "Ava," Jane said, her voice softening, "you're not looking for signs anymore. You've already found them." Her words echoed as I clutched the wine glass in my hands. I wanted to disagree, to insist that there could be a harmless explanation for everything, but I couldn't conjure one. Later, alone in bed, I stared into the darkness. David lay beside me, sleeping soundly and steadily. I heard his breathing, felt the warmth of his shoulder, and yet I felt more isolated than ever before. The shampoo, the hair, the late nights. The evidence was forming a pattern, and for the first time, a decision took root within me, a dark and silent resolve. If I couldn't uncover the truth through conventional means, I would unearth it myself. The thought consumed me. Day after day, I observed the shampoo bottle being emptied at an alarming rate, an invisible piece of evidence that only I could detect. I felt like a detective in my own home, and at the same time, like a lunatic. At night, I lay awake, endlessly replaying the possibilities in my mind. I could confront David directly. I could ask him openly and honestly. But what if he dismissed my concerns? What if he made me feel paranoid and irrational? I would be left alone with my uncertainty, without any tangible proof. I needed clarity, and I needed it in a way that he couldn't refute. The idea struck me suddenly, almost like a joke. What if someone else times his times using my shampoo, and what if I tamper with it in a way that wouldn't go unnoticed? I chuckled quietly to myself, then shook my head in disbelief. But the thought persisted. It gnawed at me, and eventually, it morphed from a fleeting jest into a meticulously crafted plan. The next morning, I visited the drugstore on Congress Avenue. It was an ordinary, overcast weekday. The shelves were stocked with merchandise, Women with shopping baskets browsed the aisles, and men stood perplexed in front of displays of razors. I pushed my shopping cart along as usual, picking up cleaning supplies, toothpaste, and a new pack of cotton pads. Then, I paused in front of the shelf, displaying hair removal creams. I hesitated, feeling a flush of heat rise in my face. What was I doing? I glanced around, half expecting my guilt to be plastered across my face for all to see. No one was paying attention to me. A woman was intently searching for shampoo for dry hair, and a man was placing 2 bottles of body wash into his basket. I reached for a tube of hair removal cream, surreptitiously concealing it between laundry detergent and paper towels. My heart raced as if I had stolen something forbidden. Back at home, I waited until David had disappeared into his office. Then, I slipped into the bathroom, closed the door behind me, and placed the shampoo bottle on the sink. I removed the tube of hair removal cream from the bag, carefully unscrewing the cap. The odor was sharp, chemical, and utterly unlike the familiar herbal scent of my shampoo. With trembling hands, I poured the hair removal cream into the shampoo bottle, carefully and slowly to prevent any spills. I mixed it thoroughly, shaking the bottle until the consistency appeared somewhat consistent. Then, I returned the bottle to its usual spot. I washed my hands, wiping the sink clean as if every trace would be a telltale giveaway. My heart pounded so loudly that I was convinced David could hear it from the other room. When I had finished, I leaned against the cool tiles and took a deep breath. Later, at dinner, I watched him as he ate, as he casually recounted details from the latest film shoot. I nodded, asked questions, and laughed at the appropriate moments. No one would have suspected that I had just taken a step that had transformed me into a different woman, no longer just the understanding wife, but a woman on a determined quest for the truth. But inside, a maelstrom raged. What if I had gone too far? What if my suspicions were valid, and she returned? What if I suddenly uncovered a certainty that I could never erase? That night, I lay awake as David slept peacefully beside me. I stared at the ceiling and waited for what was about to happen. It was as if I had set a trap, and now I stood silently beside it, waiting for someone to unwittingly step inside. The shampoo bottle sat innocuously in its place, outwardly unremarkable as always. But I knew what lurked within, and that knowledge haunted me with every trip to the bathroom, with every glance at the shower, and with every sound that drifted in from the hallway. The first 2 days passed without incident, or rather, without any incidents that I detected. I checked the bottle almost compulsively, lifting it, turning it, and carefully shaking it. The contents appeared unchanged. Perhaps no one had used it. Perhaps it was over. But my heart rate quickened every time David went to take a shower. I would stand in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the water, imagining him unscrewing the cap and massaging the foam into his hair. And simultaneously, I knew that he detested the scent. It wasn't his shampoo. So, I waited, not for him, but for her. During those days, my daily life unfolded like a distorted shadow play. I worked on my graphic design projects, clicked through emails, and edited layouts, but everything felt mechanical, devoid of genuine concentration. In reality, my mind remained fixated on the bathroom. In the evenings, I sat with David on the sofa. We watched a TV show. He laughed at the appropriate moments, made me popcorn, and casually put his arm around me, and I thought, maybe it really is just my imagination. Maybe she doesn't exist. Maybe I'm the one who is losing myself here. But then he would retreat to his office, and I would seize the opportunity to discreetly check the bathroom. The same scenario played out repeatedly. Me alone, the bottle in my hand, meticulously checking to see if it had become lighter. And then, on the 4th day, it happened. It was mid-afternoon, and David was supposedly at the office. I walked into the bathroom almost casually and stopped dead in my tracks. The bottle was noticeably lighter. I picked it up, immediately feeling the difference. My fingernail mark, which I had used as a reference point, confirmed my suspicion. At least 2 finger widths of shampoo were missing. My stomach clenched. Someone had used it. Someone had been here. I sank down onto the edge of the bathtub, staring at the bottle in my hand. The air in the bathroom felt stifling. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. This was no longer a vague feeling, no longer a stray hair that could be dismissed as a mere coincidence. This was tangible proof. She had been here in my bathroom, beneath my shower head, using my shampoo, and now she was walking around with hair removal cream on her head. I felt sick with a strange mix of fear and excitement. That night, I could barely sleep. I lay awake, listening to every sound. David breathed calmly next to me, turning over once in his sleep. I stared into the darkness and began to imagine vivid scenes, a strange woman emerging from the shower with a desperate scream, clutching handfuls of her hair. I was startled by my own thoughts. What was I doing? What if I had gone too far? And yet, a part of me felt stronger, more empowered, as if I had regained a degree of control. I knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. It started with a seemingly random occurrence. Or perhaps it wasn't random at all. Perhaps it was fate that had decided to finally lift the veil. It was a Thursday evening. I had the television playing softly in the background while I worked on my laptop. David was, predictably, absent again, supposedly stuck in yet another marathon production meeting. I'd long grown accustomed to his frequent absences. He was away far more than he was home. The news was on, a background drone, until a name jolted me to attention: Miriam Davies, the actress. Blonde, flawless, one of those instantly recognizable faces plastered across every magazine and movie screen in America. I looked up, instantly transfixed. There she was on the screen, besieged by camera flashes outside a Los Angeles movie premiere. But something was terribly wrong. She didn't look like herself. Her head was shaved, utterly bald, smooth as porcelain. Not a strand of hair, not even the slightest hint of regrowth. Just a gleaming, pale scalp reflecting the harsh glare of the spotlights. The reporters were in a frenzy, buzzing about a mysterious incident, hinting at some scandalous drama unfolding behind the scenes. Miriam seemed flustered, nervously adjusting a scarf that kept slipping, deftly dodging every pointed question. My breath hitched, my fingers froze on the keyboard. A sudden, chilling thought flashed through my mind with startling clarity: the shampoo. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There she was, this icon, suddenly hairless. And in that instant, a certainty washed over me, undeniable and inescapable. She was the one. She had been in my bathroom. She had used my shampoo. The next few days dissolved into a blur of news reports, tabloid headlines, and online speculation. Miriam Davies sporting a bald head. Coincidence or calculated scandal? What was behind the actress's sudden hair loss? The photos were everywhere. Miriam in a wig. Miriam shrouded in a headscarf. Miriam desperately warding off the intrusive cameras. I devoured the newspapers, obsessively scrutinized the images, a confusing cocktail of triumph, disgust, and simmering fear churning within me. The truth was staring me in the face, plain for all of America to see. Yet David remained conspicuously silent. He came home late each night, seemed agitated and evasive, avoiding my gaze. His responses were clipped, his explanations rushed, as if trying to fill a void with a torrent of words about his work. I watched him, saying nothing, acutely aware of the silent battle raging within him, the struggle between guilt and the desperate attempt at concealment. Then, one evening during dinner, he abruptly stopped mid-sentence. His silverware clattered against the plate, and he looked at me, a long, searching gaze. "Ava," he began, then abruptly broke off. "What?" I asked, meeting his gaze, my voice calm, almost detached. "Nothing," he mumbled, looking down. But I knew. He suspected that I knew. The following morning, the newspaper landed in the mailbox. A photo of Miriam Davies splashed across the front page. The article speculated wildly, wondering if her sudden baldness was due to a health issue or some malicious prank. I picked up the paper, pointedly placed it on the kitchen table, right between our coffee cups. David walked in, saw it, and his hand froze in midair as he reached for his mug. "Don't you know her, too?" I asked, feigning innocence. He looked at the photo, then at me, his face a mask for a fleeting moment, motionless, empty. Then he said, only vaguely, from the set, She's complicated." "I see," I replied, nodding slowly, taking a sip of my coffee, letting the silence between us thicken, becoming oppressively heavy. Two voices warred inside me. One gloated, "You did it, you exposed the truth." The other whispered, a cold dread. What if you've gone too far? What if this scandal spirals out of control? But even louder than those doubts was the undeniable certainty. My marriage, as I knew it, was irrevocably broken. It felt as if a storm was raging across the city, a storm of headlines, scandalous photos, and relentless rumors. Within days, Miriam Davies was the talk of the nation. The media was in a feeding frenzy. Miriam Davies shocks with bald head, artistic statement or illness, sabotage on set. Insiders speak of intrigues, star with a twist of fate. What's really behind it? On TV, they endlessly replayed the same images. Miriam, pale and distraught, hiding under a scarf or a ill-fitting wig on the red carpet, her head bowed, desperately avoiding the reporters' questions. On talk shows, celebrities and supposed experts dissected the possible causes. Doctors speculated about autoimmune diseases. Stylists offered opinions on brave new looks. But I knew the truth. Only I knew. I sat on the sofa each evening, remote control clutched in my hand, while David stared silently at the news from his armchair across the room. His face was a carefully constructed mask of indifference, his jaw clenched tight. I watched him from the corner of my eye. Every time Miriam's face flickered onto the screen, something flickered in his gaze. Guilt, recognition, perhaps even fear. Crazy, isn't it? I said casually, as if it were just another uneventful evening watching television. All her hair gone so suddenly. He cleared his throat, reaching for his wineglass. Yeah, terrible. Do you think she... I left the sentence hanging, watching him intently. I have no idea, he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. I barely know her. A sentence that sliced through the strained silence like a shard of glass. Asterisk, barely know her asterisk. After all this, after she'd been in my bathroom, using my shower, my shampoo. I simply nodded, offering a thin, humorless smile. Of course. The next day, even at the local coffee shop, people were buzzing about Miriam. 2 older women in line ahead of me were whispering, "Such a pretty woman," and then, "It must be cancer. Poor thing." Or, "It's probably just a PR stunt. They'll do anything for attention these days." I bit my lip, forcing myself to stay silent. The truth was burning on my tongue, but I kept it bottled up, for now. But the initial satisfaction was starting to crumble. As much as it pleased me that this woman was now publicly exposed, it also choked me with a strange, unwanted empathy. I saw her in the newspapers, on TV, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, I imagined her face when she must have first realized what had happened. Panic, despair, shame. A part of me screamed, "She deserved it." Another, more insidious part whispered, "You went too far." At home, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. David avoided me, spending longer hours locked away in his office, making furtive phone calls behind closed doors. When we passed each other in the hallway, his gaze was fleeting, evasive. He babbled about work as if he hoped to weave a tangled net of trivialities to ensnare me, distract me from the truth. But I let him. I listened, nodded, asked no questions, because I knew that the truth had long since risen up to stand between us, like a malevolent third party in our marriage, poisoning everything. On Sunday morning, when I retrieved the newspaper from the mailbox, Miriam was on the front page again. This time, it was Times, the New York Times asterisk, not some supermarket tabloid. Hollywood star loses hair. Film industry speculates about set scandal. I stood in the kitchen, deliberately placed the newspaper in the center of the table, and waited. David came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and his gaze immediately snagged on the front page. A barely perceptible twitch crossed his face, and he gripped the cup tightly, as if it had suddenly become vital for his survival. I watched him silently, my hands wrapped tightly around my own coffee mug. Say something, I thought. Admit it or lie, but do Times something asterisk. But he did nothing. He remained stubbornly silent, and in that silence, a new resolve began to solidify within me. If he refused to talk, then Times would, and not just in the privacy of our home. I would make sure all of America saw what was Times really Times behind his work. It was as if I had been holding my breath for days. Since the discovery of the hair, Since the realization about the shampoo, since the explosion of headlines about Miriam Davies, I had been suffocating in silence. I had watched David pretend that everything was normal, as if 16 years of marriage could simply be swept under the rug with lies and evasions. But inside me, something had finally snapped, something bigger than fear, stronger than shame, a primal need to finally hear the truth. That Tuesday evening, I couldn't bear it any longer. David was sitting in the living room in his favorite armchair, a half-empty glass of red wine resting on the side table. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow, making him look almost peaceful. A script lay open on the coffee table, but I knew he wasn't reading it. His fingers were mechanically flipping through the pages, but his eyes were distant, empty. I stood in the doorway, heard the frantic thumping of my own heart, and said, "We need to talk." He looked up, startled, almost annoyed. "Ava, please, not now. I'm tired." "No." My voice trembled slightly, but I stood firm. "Right now." Slowly, he set the script aside. "What's wrong?" I stepped into the room, sat down across from him, and felt my palms grow clammy. I clenched my hands into fists to hide the trembling. "For weeks," I began, "something has been wrong between us. You're different, distant, secretive." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. And then, I find blonde hair in our shower, hair that isn't ours. He blinked rapidly. His face froze. Not a word, just a faint, twitching muscle in his jaw. "Ava," he said softly, as if trying to soothe a child. "It's not what you think." I laughed, a short, dry, humorless sound. "Not what I think, David? I'm not blind." I saw my shampoo bottle getting emptier and emptier. I times no times, someone else was here. In my bathroom, in my shower. I grabbed the newspaper from the table, which I had deliberately placed there earlier, and shoved it towards him. On the front page, Miriam Davies, wearing a headscarf, under the glaring headline, "Star Loses Hair, Sabotage or Illness." He stared at the picture, then at me, his eyes wide with dawning dread. "Say it," I demanded, my voice now cuttingly clear. "Say it to my face. Be honest, just once." He lowered his head, running both hands wearily over his face. For a moment, the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing. Then he looked up, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't witnessed in years: fear. "It happened," he whispered, the words barely audible. I felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the room. I felt my hands trembling, my throat constricting. It happened. So simple, so easily said, as if it were just an unfortunate accident, a minor misstep. "How long?" I asked, my voice strained and thin. He remained stubbornly silent. "How times long, David?" I slammed my fist on the table. The wine glass rattled precariously. He looked at me, almost pleadingly, then averted his gaze. "A few months. A few months." I laughed, a short, bitter, incredulous sound. A few months where she stood in my time's bathroom, used my time's shampoo, washed her hair in my time's shower, while I was probably sitting right here, in the living room, in my own house, *. Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "And you said nothing. You looked at me as if everything was perfectly fine. You lied to me, day after day." He stood up, reaching out to me, wanting to come closer, but I recoiled, pulling away from his touch. "Ava, please! It was a mistake. A damned, stupid mistake. I didn't want this. I love you." "Love." My voice cracked, breaking on the word. "How dare you even say that word? Love is trust. Love is respect. Love means I shouldn't have to feel like a stranger in my own home." He reached out his hand again, but I wrenched myself away. 16 years, David. I believed in you. I trusted you. I spent my youth with you, my dreams, my hopes. And for what *? So you could replace me with some actress because she's blonde and glamorous and can further your career. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. It wasn't planned. It just happened. Just happened. I felt the tears streaming down my face, unchecked. It just happened that you lied to me? It just happened that you crushed my heart? It just happened that you turned our marriage into a pathetic, degrading play. A fight ensued that lasted for hours, a raw, brutal, agonizing eruption of years of pent-up frustrations and unspoken resentments. I screamed, hurling accusations that had been festering inside me for months. He was silent, initially. Then he, too, began to scream, unleashing his own torrent of anger and justifications. And then times was silent, numb with disbelief at the ugliness that had taken root between us. We hurled words at each other that we could never take back, words that scorched the earth of our shared history. I heard myself saying things I never thought possible, words I didn't recognize as my own. You're a stranger to me. I despise you. 16 years, for nothing. And in between those moments of rage and recrimination, there were moments when we both broke down, when we looked at each other and recognized the faint, flickering echo of what had once been in the other's eyes. But it was only a shadow, a pale imitation of the love we had once shared, and an echo, I knew, was simply not enough to save a marriage. The next day, I found myself sitting in a sterile, impersonal law firm, a plain office downtown, gray carpet, white walls, overflowing file folders lining the shelves. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, listened to me calmly as I spoke, recounting the agonizing details of my broken marriage. It was difficult to articulate the pain, but it also felt strangely cathartic. "We will file for divorce," she said matter-of-factly, after I had finished. "And if you want, we can get the press on your side. We can control the narrative." I nodded, wiping my eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I want that." On the way home, on the crowded subway, I cried silently. Not loudly, not visibly, just quiet tears that streamed down my cheeks, unnoticed by the other passengers. And maybe that was fitting, I thought, because our marriage, our story, hadn't really been noticed by anyone either, except for me. But as the city rushed by me, indifferent to my private grief, I felt something else, a fragile sense of clarity emerging from the wreckage. It was over, and sometimes, an ending also means a new beginning. The morning I pulled the newspaper out of the mailbox, I felt as if I were holding a live bomb in my hands. The headline screamed at me in bold black letters: "Affair, Scandal, Baldness." The secret truth behind Miriam's hair loss. Below it, in stark black and white, was my name. Ava Miller, wife of production manager David Miller, speaks out. My fingers trembled as I frantically turned the pages. There it was. My story, my words, laid bare for the world to see. "I've been silent for too long," the article quoted me as saying. "You can't end 16 years of marriage with a lie. I want the truth to come out." I stared at the lines that had come from my own mouth and felt a pang of conflicting emotions in my chest. On one hand, a surge of triumph. The truth was no longer just my dark secret, a festering wound hidden from the world. On the other, a wave of shame and vulnerability, knowing that the entire city, and perhaps the entire country, could now read about the most intimate details of my shattered life. 2 days earlier, I had been sitting at a quiet cafe on South Congress when Mark Stevens, the reporter, had approached my table. He was taller than I had imagined, slender, with a dark coat and a gaze that immediately resonated with me. Not a curious, greedy stare, as you might expect from a reporter sniffing out a scandalous story, but serious, respectful, as if he genuinely wanted to understand, to reassure me that I wasn't alone. "Miss Miller," he had said, extending his hand, his handshake firm, warm. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, feeling unsure and exposed, my palms sweating. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had never confided such deeply personal things to a stranger before. We sat down at a small table tucked away in a quiet corner of the cafe. The place was bustling, a jumble of voices, the comforting scent of pastries hanging in the air. But I felt like I was trapped inside a bubble, separated from it all. "You know, I've been writing about celebrities, scandals, and tawdry affairs for 15 years, Mark began, placing his notepad in front of him. "But I don't want to exploit your story. I want it to be told in your time's words. I want to understand." Something in me relaxed at his sincere words. I nodded, took a deep breath, and began to talk. I told him about that fateful Saturday morning, about the blonde hair in the shower drain, about how I had initially tried to suppress the nagging suspicions, hoping I was just being paranoid, but how the seed of doubt had quickly taken root and gnawed at me relentlessly. I spoke of the sleepless nights I had spent lying awake beside David, who breathed calmly next to me, oblivious to the turmoil raging within me, not knowing if I was being irrational or if I was finally waking up to the painful truth. I told him about the shampoo that got emptier and emptier, about my desperate attempt to confirm my suspicions by placing a secret mark on the bottle, about the moment I made the calculated decision to tamper with the shampoo, adding the hair removal cream. As I spoke, Mark listened intently, calm and focused, with a seriousness that sometimes made me falter. He took notes, but never frantically, never interrupting my train of thought. He simply asked for more detail if he needed to understand something more precisely. And then I said it, finally, my voice cracking with emotion. I was sitting in front of the TV, and there she was, Miriam Davies, without her hair. All of America was talking about it, and I times knew asterisk. I knew she had stood in my shower. It was like a punch to the gut. Tears began to stream down my face, despite my best efforts to control them. I hadn't planned on crying, but the dam had finally broken. Mark silently handed me a napkin, his expression devoid of pity or feigned regret, just quiet presence and genuine empathy. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said after a long, thoughtful pause. "But you need to know, if we publish this, there's no going back. It's going to cause a media frenzy. You'll face attacks, doubts, mockery, but also respect. Are you ready?" I wiped away my tears, took a deep breath, and met his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice filled with a newfound conviction. "I am ready. I've been silent for too long." And now, 2 days later, I was sitting in my kitchen, the newspaper clutched in my hand, my coffee untouched, stone cold. I read the lines over and over, my name, my words, blasted across the front page. A part of me rejoiced in the fact that I was no longer the silent wife in the background, the invisible woman whose feelings and pain had been ignored for so long. I finally had a voice. But another part of me tensed up, bracing myself for the inevitable backlash. Now everyone knew what had happened. My neighbors, the barista at the coffee shop, maybe even people I hadn't seen since high school. When I went to the coffee shop shortly after, I felt like people were looking at me differently, scrutinizing me more closely. Maybe I was just imagining it, projecting my own anxieties onto them, but maybe not. The barista smiled warmly, as always, but her eyes lingered on my face longer than usual. 2 men whispered as I walked past their table, their gaze lingering on my back. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, wishing I could somehow become invisible, melt into the crowd. And at the same time, I realized that's exactly what I times didn't times want anymore. I didn't want to be invisible. I wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. That evening, my phone rang. It was Mark. I hesitated for a moment, then finally picked up. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice calm, warm, reassuring. "I wanted to thank you. The article is out, and it's being widely discussed. But you know what? Many readers are writing in to say that they see themselves in your story, that they want to be brave enough to stop being silent, too." Tears welled up in my eyes again, unbidden. "Are you serious?" "Yes," he said. "I often write about scandals that are empty and meaningless, stories that are only good for a few fleeting headlines. But your story, that's real. It has meaning. It can make a difference." I held the phone to my ear, silent, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak, and felt a strange, unexpected pull in my chest. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel just anger and pain, but also something else, a kind of warmth, a sense of connection, a feeling of being understood. "Thank you," I finally whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "No," he replied, his voice soft. "Thank times, you asterisk." That night, I fell asleep with the newspaper on my nightstand, my name plastered across the front page. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel loss and despair. I also felt the faintest glimmer of hope, the quiet inkling that my life might be able to begin anew. And maybe, just maybe, That new beginning had already started with one phone call. The weeks following the publication of the article were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and unsettling experiences. The divorce papers had been officially filed, my name was splashed across the newspapers, and my neighbors regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I felt like I was moving through two separate worlds, the old, broken world of my failed marriage and the new one, still unfamiliar and uncertain, where I was forging a new identity. In the midst of it all, Mark reached out, not as a reporter looking for his next scoop, but as a person offering genuine support. "Miss Miller," he wrote in a message, "I know you have a lot on your plate right now, but if you ever want to get coffee, without a notepad or any more questions, let me know." I stared at those lines for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. A part of me wanted to immediately text back, yes, to seize the opportunity for connection and companionship. But another, more cautious part of me whispered, "You are wounded, vulnerable, don't let anyone get too close, protect yourself." But eventually, defying my own fears, I replied, "I'd love that." We met again at a small cafe in the West End. It was a gray, overcast afternoon. A fine drizzle hung in the air. Mark was already sitting by the window, a newspaper beside him, but this time he wasn't wearing his professional persona. He was simply Mark, dressed in a comfortable wool sweater. "Ava," he greeted me, smiling warmly. And it was the first time he had said my first name without a title, without the formal Miss Miller. It sounded easy, natural, warm. We talked for a long time, initially about mundane things, the unique vibe of Austin, the unseasonably cold winter, the best cappuccino in town, then gradually shifted to more difficult and personal subjects. "It's strange," I said at one point, watching the rain streak down the window pane. "When you read your life story in a newspaper, it suddenly belongs to everyone, and to yourself the least." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "And at the same time," he said, "it also frees you, because you no longer have to hide anything. You can finally be yourself." I fell silent, contemplating his words, watching the raindrops trace their meandering paths down the glass. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll never be able to trust again," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe," he replied, meeting my gaze. "But maybe it's not about trusting again times immediately asterisk. Maybe it's about finding someone who is patient, someone who is willing to wait until you are ready, until you feel safe enough to open up again." His words hit me deeper than I had expected, resonating with a truth I had been afraid to acknowledge. We met again several times in the weeks that followed. A long walk through Zilker Park, where we laughed when a rambunctious golden retriever suddenly jumped into the river. An evening at the movies, where we sat silently next to each other, our hands almost touching, but not quite. It was nothing official, nothing tangible. No declarations of love, no promises of a future together. But it was a feeling, a subtle whisper in the air, a hint that there could times be something more, if I could find the courage to reach for it. One evening, alone at home, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. I saw my own face, etched with the lines of pain and weariness, my dark hair slightly disheveled, my eyes that had cried so many tears in the past few months. And I said quietly to myself, with a newfound conviction, "I am no longer the woman who just waited, silently enduring whatever life threw at her. I am no longer the one who stays silent, swallowing her own truth. I am more." And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. The divorce wasn't finalized yet. My heart was still scarred and tender, but I felt, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new life, a new chapter filled with possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes you need everything to fall apart to find yourself again. Sometimes something has to break completely to make room for something new and beautiful to grow. And sometimes it's not the years you thought you lost that truly matter, but the strength and resilience you gain from surviving those losses. I didn't know where my burgeoning relationship with Mark would ultimately lead. Maybe just to a cherished friendship, a source of comfort and support. Maybe to something bigger, something deeper, something more meaningful. But the beautiful thing was, I realized, I didn't have times to know. For the first time in years, I was living fully in the present moment, not consumed by anxieties about the future, not trapped in a rigid construct of future plans and unrealistic expectations. One evening, when the air was warm and fragrant and the birds were singing their evening chorus, I sat on my balcony, a soft blanket wrapped around my shoulders, a glass of wine in my hand. I looked out over the rooftops of Austin, where the sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of pink and gold. And I thought of everything that lay behind me, of the pain, the betrayal, the crushing weight of disappointment, but also of the resilience I had discovered within myself, the strength I never knew I possessed, of the young woman who had said yes with such hope at 19, of all those nights I questioned my own path, of the instant I resolved to finally speak my truth. I smiled then and whispered to myself, it wasn't all for naught, not a single day of it.